Welcome to the exciting Quiz Options channel. It's great to see you here. Who was the first is the topic of the video. We have 50 great questions on a range of topics. Check your general knowledge and learn about the pioneers in history. Let's start quizzing. Here's your first question. Who was the first person to reach the South Pole? Who was the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean? Who was the first emperor of unified China? Who was the first person to discover penicillin? Who was the first actor to portray James Bond in a film? Who was the first woman to win an Academy Award for Best Director? Who was the first Roman emperor? Who was the first person to set foot on Antarctica? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in Physics? Who was the first female Prime Minister of India? Who was the first American president to be impeached? Who was the first person to sail around the world? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in Literature? Who was the first woman to win a Grand Slam title in tennis? Who was the first pharaoh of ancient Egypt? Who was the first person to fly an airplane? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Peace Prize? Who was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry? Who was the first Holy Roman Emperor? Who was the first person to reach the summit of Mount Everest? Who was the first person to write Romeo and Juliet? Who was the first person to win the Tour de France 5 times? Who was the first woman to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? Who was the first person to run a mile in under 4 minutes? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine? Who was the first person to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? Who was the first female astronaut to travel to space? Who was the first person to invent the telephone? Who was the first person to win the FIFA World Cup as a player and coach? Who was the first person to win the Academy Award for Best Actor? Who was the first person to land on the continent of Australia? Who was the first person to propose the theory of evolution by natural selection? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in economics? Who was the first woman to fly as a passenger on a solo transatlantic flight? Who was the first person to invent the light bulb? Who was the first person to reach the North Pole? Who was the first person to win the Academy Award for Best Actress? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in Peace posthumously? Who was the first person to publish the theory of general relativity? Who was the first person to establish the Mongol Empire? Who was the first person to win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry? Who was the first person to walk on the bottom of the Mariana Trench? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry twice? Who was the first person to discover America? Who was the first woman to win a gold medal at the Olympics? Who was the first person to win the Pulitzer Prize for drama? Who was the first person to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean? Who was the first person to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine twice? Who was the first person to win the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor? Who was the first person to circumnavigate the globe? If you are watching till here, and if you learned something then, subscribe to the Quiz Options channel for more videos like this. Thank you for watching. You can check this playlist for more interesting knowledge.